Hey guys, it's Danny. Alrighty, today we're gonna talk about orchid fragrance, one of my favorite topics when it comes to orchids. And this is inspired by a comment that I got lately talking about the Oncidium satuanum. Yeah, you know, that beautiful twinkle ancestor that most of us kind of love and enjoy the fragrance of. Well, there are people who absolutely hate it. And my viewer was saying that she got absolutely sick from the fragrance. She threw away the orchid and anyway, and that's always unfortunate when it happens, when everybody likes the fragrance but you find it repulsing. I can totally relate to that. So I'm gonna tell you today which orchids I don't detect as other people, as well as talking about why we have this difference in between us, what causes us to detect fragrances differently. We're going to talk about what orchids are trying to achieve with the fragrance, and pretty much just have a general discussion about fragrance and why some people like some fragrances and others don't like them. So first, let me just start the subject by saying that if a majority of people really like a fragrance and you don't, there's nothing wrong with you. There's nothing wrong with the other person either. It's just that we absolutely detect fragrances differently. It's not even a personal preference. Even though in some cases, to some degree, it is, in many cases, it actually apparently has to do with our DNA. Now, I'm not a scientist and I was never good at anatomy in high school, so I won't try to explain how we detect fragrances. Scientists have some questions regarding that anyway. But according to some articles and some research, it would appear it is closely related to our DNA. And I will share with you down below the article that mentions it. Therefore, if it is within ourselves to like or dislike certain fragrances, I don't think it is something we can actually control. That's part of it, but referring to something more familiar to us, we tend to associate fragrance with memories. And even though a fragrance is described as beautiful by a majority of people and we detect it as nice and not repulsive, we can actually have a very bad memory associated to it and therefore not prefer it, not like it. For example, the smell of roses, most people love it, but I knew somebody who had really bad memories for whatever reason with roses and could not stand their fragrance. Even though they weren't repulsed by the fragrance, it was just something psychological. And I do have those types of fragrances as well. And sometimes I have memories that I cannot recollect and I don't really know why a particular fragrance makes me feel uneasy, but I do. And again, this is something that I'm not going to try and explain scientifically, but I wanted to mention it because it is something very, very familiar. Did you ever like a perfume and then you gave it to your mother, father, lover, friend, whatever, to smell and they said, ugh, it's not nice at all, but you love it? Well, that's because we do detect fragrance differently, one, and second, we might have different memories and different feelings associated with those fragrances. And I do believe there is more to the story, and we will discover more about how we perceive fragrances. But for now, this is a little bit of an insight into what makes us so different. Now, this came as a little bit of a surprise for me. Ever since I started to do YouTube videos, I knew that people have different preferences, but I didn't really realize that they can detect fragrance very differently than I can. And sometimes I do see people in articles, blogs, or videos or whatever saying, I don't know what people like this fragrance, it's absolutely repulsive, it's nothing special. You have to understand that what you smell might not be what most people smell, or at least part of the people. So I think it's always good to share how fragrance smells to you, but at the same time realize that this is a very personal opinion, one that might very well be in a majority of opinions or in a minority of opinions. Nobody's necessarily right here, but there is such a thing as a majority of people like this fragrance or a majority of people dislike it. I shall give you some examples. Usually when I talk about orchid fragrance on my channel, I try to get into the habit of saying generally most people enjoy this fragrance, or I believe this is a easy to like fragrance. I don't think many people will be repulsed by it, and so on and so forth, because there are a few, let's say, guidelines or traits that most people like. Most people like floral fragrances, even though they can be diverse, of course. But when you say floral, you don't necessarily say syrupy or sweet or chocolatey. At the same time, most people like sweet fragrances. Not many people like sharp fragrances, sour fragrances, or peppery fragrances. So based on the comments that I do get over the years, I do make this type of statistic. But it doesn't mean that it is generally applied to everybody. Yes, most people like the fragrance of lilies, but there are some people which I'm sure hate it. Maybe they have a bad memory related to the fragrance, maybe they just detect it as something very pungent, very foul. And that is perfectly fine. I'll give you some examples of what I detect as maybe not so nice and other people detect as nice. But statistically speaking, people do generally tend to like fragrances that butterflies and honeybees like as well. Sweet, florally, rosy, lily-like, lily of the valley, so on and so forth. Everything that would attract a butterfly or even a bee, honeybee to be more exact. There are many types of bees. Generally, that tends to appeal to us as well. And there are many orchids which attract these pollinators specifically. The good thing about pollinators is that they don't have memories attached to fragrances, and most probably they don't detect fragrance as differently in between them as we do. Therefore, an orchid's fragrance, as well as any other flower's fragrance, doesn't care about what we detect. It cares about forming and perfecting this fragrance to be to the liking of the butterfly and the bee. However, orchids don't only try to attract these beautiful insects, but sometimes they try to attract even creepy ones. For those of you who are paying members of the American Orchid Society, there is a webinar which is lovely there, talking about fragrances and about different orchids which try to attract different insects. I'll give you one example that I did find an article on the internet as well. There is a dendrobium orchid which tries to imitate the alarm pheromone of a bee. It releases molecules that imitate a bee in trouble. Its main pollinator is a wasp, which is coming to pretty much feast on the bee in trouble. And when it gets there and moves around the orchid in search of the bee, it pollinates the orchid, but it shall receive no bee. So some orchids actually try to deceive pollinators. This attraction is not always a good thing. Some orchids really don't give anything in return for being pollinated. And if you think this is weird, let's just think about bulbophyllums, which in some cases smell foul because they're trying to attract flies and other insects which are attracted to very disturbing fragrances. Their life cycle actually depends on things decomposing, so the flowers try to imitate something decomposing in nature. But these are two extremes. Of course, we can have fragrances which are somewhere in between, and the best example that I can find is the Cycnotus Wine Delight. Now, this little orchid is one of my favorite fragrances. However, it doesn't smell flowery or sweet or anything very generally liked by people. To me, it smells very sharp, like a pharmacy, maybe very minty, so hard to describe. It has a sweetness to it, but overall, it is something that I am sure not everybody likes, and I am not entirely sure if a majority of people like the fragrance. This speaks to me, but my boyfriend is slightly repulsed by the fragrance. And it doesn't smell like something is dying, it actually smells really fresh. But it reminds of medicine. And when it comes to medicine, I don't think everybody has pleasant memories, that's one. And I don't think everybody considers the smell of medicine as perfumey and nice and something to be desired. So would I use the fragrance of the Cycnotus Wine Delight as house freshener? No. But I am very happy to sniff the fragrance from time to time. This little orchid is indeed a debatable fragrance one. It certainly attracts much less people than a very rosy scented cattleya. Now, fragrance usually goes hand in hand with colors and shapes when it comes to flowers. It's not only the fragrance that attracts the pollinators, let's say the fragrance is the signal from far away, but also the colors and shape of the flowers are key in attracting pollinators. Thus, many orchid species have various colors and various shapes, but one interesting group are the nighttime fragrant orchids, such as the brassavolas and gracums, some eranges and other orchids, which typically have green, pale, or white flowers. They also have a pretty sharp fragrance and a pretty strong fragrance. One of the pollinators for these orchids are moths. I'm not sure if they're exclusive pollinators or not, but definitely this type of fragrance attracts moths in the nighttime. And being that we don't have as much light, the orchid is trying to make the best out of moonlight and starlight, whatever light it has at her disposal, and creates very pale, very white flowers that bounce off the light. In this case, the orchid doesn't necessarily need colors. However, fragrance in the nighttime without visual cues needs to be sharp, needs to be very powerful, so pollinators detect it from a distance. Now, to humans, this particular fragrance usually translates as a very soapy, detergenty, clean, sharp fragrance. Not everybody enjoys the fragrance because it is indeed very strong and very sharp in most cases. And when we're dealing with extremes like these, statistically speaking, we usually have a bigger community of people disliking something. When a fragrance is more subtle, there is a bigger community liking that fragrance. So the more subtle, the better, the more powerful, the worst when it comes to statistics. For example, I personally prefer strong fragrances, but I'm not a majority. So in the case of brassavolas, ingracums, and other nighttime smelling orchids, which I find some of the best smelling orchids, I did actually encounter a lot of my viewers who say they cannot really tolerate the fragrance because it is so powerful and so strong. And I can totally see that. Would I sleep with this in the room? Probably not. It is beautiful and nice and strong, but I don't want it in my nose, if you know what I mean. There are people who really cannot stand this fragrance, and usually when I talk about brassavolas and very strong fragrances, I do try to make a point of saying this is a strong smell, maybe don't sleep with this orchid next to you or in the same room, and so on and so forth. And then there is the instance in which we absolutely do not detect a particular fragrance. And I know there is a perfume out there that I absolutely cannot detect, and everybody can. I usually am good with sweet perfumes. I like them, I can sense them very well. There is, however, a perfume that if you spray it on me, it's like it's not there for me. And this is Prada Candy, something like that. It's a sweet perfume and very popular one. I went to the store, tried it on, I could not detect it. And I was like, what's happening? Oh no. Anyway, so there are those instances in which we don't detect certain scents or notes in perfumes, so we're only left with part of them, or we don't detect a fragrance at all. And when it comes to orchids, it's really hard to determine when this happens, when it's us or them, because orchids don't always release fragrance. If they're stressed or dehydrated, they might not release fragrance. If the light is not adequate, again, they won't release their fragrance. Time of day, humidity, and maybe other external factors do influence how a fragrance is released, how it is perceived, and how strong it is at the same time. So it's a very complex subject, and detecting a fragrance and saying this orchid smells in a certain way is a delicate thing to get accurately. I'm sure there are people who make it their life, or actually their job, to smell fragrances, detect them correctly, have that fragrance palette, if you will. I'm not one of them. Most of us cannot detect as many fragrances as the people who are in charge of developing perfumes can detect. It's like with food. But I do believe you need to have a certain set of skills or a certain set of DNA sequences to be able to actually perceive some perfumes. Therefore, as much as I like perfume and I like everything in my life to be fragrant and perfumed, I could never develop a fragrance because I don't have a complete palette. There are fragrances which I cannot detect, and it sucks for me, but that's the reality. So now let me tell you from my experience what orchids I find slightly but people actually enjoy. Now, one of the orchids that pops into my mind right now, and I swear I want to purchase it again just to test it out, is the Osmoglossum pulchellum. I purchased that orchid because many people said it was very fragrant. Also, there's another YouTuber describing the fragrance as this really outer worldly thing, and I want to have that fragrance in my life as well. When my pulchellum bloomed, it smelled like ink to me, which is not something that I correlate with a nice memory or that I like in any way. So there is a chance that I personally cannot detect the certain notes and the whole palette of the fragrance, or there was something with that individual which didn't make it. It died, I think, in the Fusarium outbreak of 2 or 3 years ago. But anyway, I want to try it again with the Pulchellum because it's one of those things that people really enjoy and I want to enjoy it as well. But there is this reality that I might not detect everything. So you can imagine my surprise, if we can call it like that, when this guy bloomed. I was waiting for it for 2 years, I smell it and it's like, first grade. But he's not the only one. I actually had an orchid which to me smelled like horse poop. Now, it's not one of those very popular orchids and it could have been mislabeled, so I will not say that people like it necessarily. There are some orchids which look very close to it or are related in any way, which people describe as beautiful. This one to me smelled like horse poop, but there was somebody in the comment section saying, you know what, I think I would enjoy that because I grew up on a farm and I do have lovely memories of that. So even if the orchid smelled like a stable and in your childhood you had horses, that could be great. And I actually have a memory that I know some people will consider ew. But at some point we went to visit this shepherd in the mountains, and P.S. I didn't grow up on a farm, I didn't have farm animals and stuff, but we went to visit him and he had his own herd of sheep, his own little garden. The guy was making cheese, polenta, I think this is the English name for it, which is actually a very traditional Romanian food, and tomatoes. I swear to you, that was the best cheese and the best tomatoes I have ever eaten in my whole existence. And I absolutely adore that smell of fresh cheese. He was making the cheese in these wooden barrels somehow. And that smell, which is very hard to describe, it's not like it smells like cheese. But anyway, that fragrance, it's so full of memories for me. I was with my family. It just makes me feel warm inside that whenever I detect it in a cheese aroma, I'm like, oh yes, that memory. Now, would I like my house to smell like cheese? No. But from time to time when I detect that fragrance, I just feel good about it. So there is the chance that some orchids which people really dislike, you might actually like, which is always great when that happens. But for me, smelling of horse poop, not really that great. But in the end, it's always a surprise, isn't it? And bottom line, if people say this orchid smells like caramel, like they said about the Chisis that I gave away, and I didn't detect the caramel, if you don't actually detect that fragrance, don't get upset. It is actually a personal thing. And statistically speaking, there will always be a majority who describes something in a certain way and a minority who describe them differently or who don't like it, and so on and so forth. And whether you're in the majority or minority, it doesn't matter. It is a personal thing. It means you can make it your own. It means you can have an orchid which speaks maybe only to you from the entirety of people that you know. And speaking about that, my boyfriend, oh my goodness, I sometimes give him orchids to smell and ask him, what do you think it smells like? In the hopes that I can get some more insight from a different person. And his answer in 99% of the cases is, I don't know, jasmine? Jasmine? I mean, except for the Sherry Baby, which he agrees it smells like chocolate, and the Signotus Wine Delight, which he doesn't like, everything else, Cattleyas, even Brassavolas, and all of those things, they smell like jasmine to him. So fragrance works in mysterious ways. Alrighty guys, so this was the discussion of today. Let me know down below in the comment section if you have orchids which are renowned to smell in a certain way, but you detect something else. Which are those orchids? What do you detect? Tell me your experiences. And with that said, thank you so much for watching. You know the drill. Like or dislike this video below. Subscribe to my channel for regular orchid videos, tutorials, Q&As, and other fun orchid subjects. And if you like YouTube to notify you whenever I upload a new video, just turn on all notifications for my channel. If you're interested in the products that I use, the setups, the light, all of those things are in the description as well, so just expand it. With that said, I'll see you guys tomorrow. Bye!